No big long intro this week. I just want to get right into it. This is 20 things that I wish I had known when I was starting Substance Designer. Would have made my life way easier. So let's just get to them. A fun thing you can do here, which is really cool, adds a lot of it's a very interesting effect. Let's say we're using it for sand here, and it's really subtle, so it's hard to see. But let's say we wanted some like moss to grow on the tops of these things. So if this is a wall, which it is, you might want some effects on the top, like whether it's snow on top or sand or moss or whatever you want it to be wet on top. There's a bunch of things you can do with this. That's a fun mask to get. So what you can do is I'm just going to make a really quick kind of mossy color by just taking a moisture noise and picking just a couple fun green tones I like. So kind of a middle, a bit of a more saturated dark one, and then a kind of brighter, more orange one, just to get something to look at. And you can do whatever you want there. You can blend this on top of your base color, and a cool way to get a mask, and you could, we're just doing color, but you could do normal and roughness, whatever you want. If you look at your normal map, and remember we know our cool hotkeys to look at the different channels. The red channel, so I'm clicking R, shows you the light, essentially, you can think of it like light, coming in from the right side of the texture. So the white faces face positive X, the black faces face negative X. In the green channel, you have the opposite, rotated 90, not the opposite, but rotated 90 degrees. So the white faces are facing negative Y, pointing down, and the black faces are facing positive Y, pointing up. So what's cool here is we can just split this out, right? So we can grab only the green channel, and I'll put on auto level here for good measure, just to make sure we have our full range. We're going to need to invert it. And this is a mask of the tops of stuff. If you just plug this in, you'll see that the moss gets laid on the tops of the skulls. Really, really cool, really quick and effective. And you can, of course, scan this or level it, whatever you want to do in order to adjust that mask. So if I take the histogram scan and I don't do anything, it'll turn it off. But if I turn the position up, it'll grow the amount of moss. And if I put the contrast really high, it's the tightness of that mask. So you can get really, really cool effects here by just playing with this. Same thing with the roughness. I could take the roughness channel and take our mask here, subtract it from our roughness, which will make it darker where our moss is. So it'll get slick and smooth wherever the moss is and make the texture a lot more wet where the moss happens to be. So this is like 4 or 5 nodes, and it's a really powerful effect. You can make really cool stuff with this. Just remember that your normal map is different information where the faces are pointing, and you can use that to drive a bunch of really interesting effects. This is a really quick, cool one. So you're going to see a lot of times people are trying to make shapes, and you're trying to just blend or cut away different parts of shapes. So if I was trying to make a moon shape, like a half moon, what I might do is start with a circle, and then you'll take a gradient linear, rotate it, give it a histogram scan here, something like this, cut it in half, and then you'll set this blend mode to multiply to just cut that moon in half, and you can move the histogram scan's position just to get more or less of the moon. This is just a lot of extra nodes and setup. What's really cool is this is just available to you on the blend mode by default. So you could plug this into either input really, but if we put this into the background, we can use the cropping area sliders here to just show certain parts of the background. Right, so we can achieve the exact same thing just using these sliders that are already on the blend mode. We don't need to make all these extra nodes. And we can do it from all sorts of different directions. If I want to make Pac-Man or whatever, or cut, different parts of this off. I did the same thing here when I was creating the lock for our, like the locking mechanism for our padlock here. I started with this shape, which is the whole thing, and then I just moved my masks until I was cutting the area I wanted away. And that's just much simpler than blending in a bunch of shapes with all sorts of different nodes. It just gets it done much quicker. This one's really cool, and we did it in a Patreon video recently, actually. But when I went to color these stones, I mostly just picked my own colors and ran them through a bunch of gradient maps to get the colors I wanted for the rock. What I'll see a lot of people doing, and I'm just going to replace all of this very quickly with a moisture noise, and I'll put this into a gradient map, and this is a classic. They find a piece of reference they like, and they'll take their gradient map and go to the gradient editor. Stop me if you've done this before. They'll go to pick gradient, and they'll run that all over their texture. So I'm just gonna, on my other monitor, run it, that line all over that texture. And that's how they sample the color. And then this becomes their, the basis of their albedo texture. Now this adds a bunch of noises and there's a ton of sample points. You can, like if I pick the gradient again, just running it all over it, I can change the precision here to add less points or more points. But this doesn't give you a ton of control and it's really messy because you can grab colors you don't want. It can be a bit of a pain in the ass. A cool thing you can do is actually import that texture. And instead of using a gradient map, use a gradient dynamic. So this takes a grayscale image input and then a grayscale or color image input into the gradient. And it just takes this moisture noise in this case and remaps it to a line of pixels in this image. And in this case, it's picking the top pixels, that first row, and just running all the way through them. So you can see if I replace the moisture noise with just a linear gradient, you'll see we'll just get a gradient that samples the exact top left pixel and all the way forward of that texture. So you can use this to pull color information from imported textures and use it to drive the rest of the texture. Obviously the gradient isn't very helpful here, but something like the moisture noise is. And it's also much more live. So for example, I can go to the gradient dynamic and switch which line of pixels we're sampling to kind of step through the image from top to bottom and grab a different sampling of the color. I can also do stuff like blur the input bitmap so that there's not as many colors being chosen, right? Because the blurrier this image is, the less specific colors we pick. In fact, if I turn the blur all the way to like a really high strength, it'll just be the average color of that texture. So using some really simple controls, changing the intensity of this blur is one of them. You can change how sensitive this is to changes in color, which is really nice. I can go to the gradient dynamic and change where in the texture I'm sampling, right? So we can smooth this out if we want, so it's just less noisy. And we have more similar colors. We can scan through this to find a different area of the texture. We can make color adjustments to this. So if we wanted to, if we thought this was too red for our wall back here, we could go to the red channel and just take some of the red out. And you can make all sorts of fun adjustments and let the gradient dynamic just work from there and sample everything you need. So this is really powerful and really good if you're just learning how to put albedos together. This can be a really big leg up. Sort of a weird one here, but I've always found this one really helpful. If you're making any kind of water damage, a really neat trick you can do is the first thing you'll do, or like coffee stains, whatever, a lot of just like liquid based stains you would use this trick for. So I'm just going to scan to make a texture for the kind of profile of the stain there. And I'm going to invert this and just put it into our roughness map here just so we can see it working. So where we have these stains, it's going to get much smoother, much more wet here. So you can see the kind of water stains there, which is neat. But if you see a lot of water stains, because of the surface tension, they tend to dry out in the middle and they stay wetter along the rim. If you've seen this where it's right here actually when I put my water bottle down, you can see where there's a moisture ring where the surface tension is held up and the water stays there longer. And a lot of good texturing is attention to detail about this stuff and trying to replicate things that are actually happening on the material. A cool way to do this effect, because we just need this to get weaker in the middle. A fun thing you can do is just blur this and simply subtract it from the original shape. Because it's so much brighter in the middle now, when we subtract, the shape gets nice and dark in the middle. And if we auto level this, we should have the auto level here just to be safe, so we make sure we have our full luminance value. And we do this instead. This is this really cool effect where the middle of those water stains isn't nearly as intense as the edge. And we can increase this as much as we want. You can change the strength of the bevel to exaggerate the effect. You can level this so that it's much stronger on the lip. There's lots of ways you can increase this. But I just think this is a really cool quick tip of a tip to make this like really interesting texture that's really useful, because a lot of stuff has kind of moisture damage on it. And this is a really quick, effective way of replicating that visual look. Staying with our little kind of pseudo cobblestones here, a cool thing about the normal levels node that I think some people forget is that you actually have access to auto levels and invert grayscale on the basic levels node. So the auto levels is really helpful because if something back behind it changes, it updates. The levels node has that auto level function available. It's up here. And honestly, if you know that the thing behind it is never going to change, you can use the auto level up here and it works perfectly well as well. You also have access to an invert grayscale here. So you'll see me as I'm working often, like I don't necessarily always use the invert grayscale. If I wanted this inverted, I'll just use a level because I might want to adjust the levels anyway, but I also want it inverted. When I eventually do the node tier list, this is why the invert grayscale is quite far down for me, because you can just use them on the base levels. So just keep in mind, you have access to an auto level and an invert grayscale on the stock levels if you need them. Cracks. So this is stuff you'll do in a lot of materials. A lot of people, they do is they start with the cells 4 here. I think the issue, this is a Voronoi noise, really. The thing that I think, well, it's a certain type of Voronoi noise. I think the problem with this one a lot of the times is that it's just very even. Basically, all of the cells here are relatively similar, like they're mostly the same size. It's common for me to want to build my own. Now you can use the Voronoi fractal for this. There's some other things you can do. But a cool way to make your own here is to use something like a tile sampler. You can leave these at whatever you want. We're going to increase that later, but I'll make these really, really small. In fact, these can just be a single pixel. They don't have to be big at all. And I'll just give these a random position and some random luminance. And what you'll do here is basically make your own Voronoi noise. So I'll put this color random on, so they're all a random grayscale here. And we'll use our handy distance node, which we've been using earlier for closing the bevels and for the flood fills. And we're going to get a threshold here. And this is just going to make all of our randomly colored squares all perfectly white if we use the base settings. And plug that into mask. And you can see as we set the distance all the way up to full and check only source, we're building a Voronoi noise. Now, this still has the same problem that there's evenly sized cells for the most part. So if we swap this out, it's not much different. And we can increase the amount of these cells by just taking up the number of squares we generate. A similar problem though, what we could do is the distance node is just spreading out those grayscale values from our initial little squares until they come into contact with another expanding shape. So how big these are really is determined by how close their neighbors are to them, so that when they grow out, they hit into each other. You see over here where this really small cell is, it's because he didn't go too far before he hit a bunch of his neighbors. So he stays pretty small. Whereas a bigger one out here, he goes a pretty far distance before he even encounters a neighbor up here. So he's a bit of a bigger cell. So now that we know that, what we need to do is make it so that we have areas of this texture where there aren't many boxes, and then some areas where there's much more of them. And that will create in areas where there's a smaller density of box, there will be bigger cells because they have more room to grow before they hit a friend. And in areas where they're really tightly packed, they won't be able to go very far before they hit a friend. So I'll do something like plug a cloud into the mask map input of a tile sampler. And what this does is just mask out boxes depending on where they are in this texture. So the darker this texture is, the more likely it will be that one will get passed out. So as an example, if you plugged in like just a linear gradient into this, you'd see that as I turn the mask map up, I'm going to start filtering them away from the dark area on that input texture. And we have a whole video on tile samplers that's worth checking out where we go through all these details or all these settings in great detail. But if I go down to the mask map threshold, you'll see I start peeling them away from the left side. And as a result, we get much bigger cells on the left side of the texture. If we use something like a cloud, we're going to pull them apart from the black areas of that cloud. And as a result, in the dark areas of this cloud, we create much bigger cells. And in the white areas, we have much smaller cells because they had not as far to go before they hit a neighbor. Whereas these ones out here are basically on their own now, so they can be free to become quite large. So I think this does a really good job of varying this up and making it feel a lot more natural. And I use custom Voronoi shapes for this basically in every graph that needs cracking. Bevels and auto levels. So let's say you have a bunch of tiles you're trying to make and you want these to be a little beveled. So you put your bevel on it and you see a lot of people doing this where they kind of just eyeball how big they want the bevel to be. So maybe it's like that. They put this into their texture and there you go, you're fine. Now, what can happen is this bevel width is really related to the size of the mask to begin with, because you're specifying a width in like a distance relative to the size of the overall texture. So if I change these, I can be in a situation where the bevel's no longer relevant. Now they touch each other, right? Whereas when we had fewer of the bricks, they had this far distance from each other. So often what you'll see me doing with bevels is just almost always setting these to full. Now this ensures they stay closed, right? In the scenario where we wanted these to just barely touch, that's perfect. But again, if you decide to change something downstream, now they no longer touch. So we want these to remain consistent everywhere we use them. So what I'll do instead is just crank the bevel to full. I'm usually either setting bevels to full 1 or full -1, depending on what I need. And the texture will get very bright. That's just because of the distance node. We've slammed everything into each other and things are super, super bright now because there's so little distance between the objects. So I will almost always follow this up with an auto level. And what's cool there is now the bevels are automatically closed. No matter how many tiles we put and no matter what the configuration of them is, the bevel is always completely shut. So this is really helpful so you're not always in a situation where you make a change back here and then you have to adjust the bevel, and then you decide to make a change back here and then you adjust the bevel and you're just on and on and on Sisyphus mode. Jumping off the previous tip, you can see here in this skull wall graph, I built for the skulls here a random grayscale value for the different cobblestone tiles here. And I wanted 2 flood filter random grayscales because I'm driving effects twice. I'm using it once to drive the color picker here to tint all the stones a different color. And I'm using it again here to tint them a different luminance value. So some get darker, some get brighter. So it can be a pain to create this happens all the time where you want to use multiple flood filter random grayscales, where you just change the seed of it so that you get a different version. A cool trick you can do here is actually use a flood filter random color instead, and then use a distance like you would normally because you have to get rid of all this black space. So again, you plug the flood fill into the source input, and then whatever went into the mask of the flood fill goes into the mask of the distance. But what's cool about the flood filter random color is because this is a random color in R, G, and B, right? Some random value in red, some random value in green, some random value in blue, which I can see by pressing RGB in the 2D viewport or hitting C to go back to color. I can use an RGBA split node after this, and I have 3 random grayscales here. So for the price of 1 flood fill node and the space of 1 flood fill node and not needing to use multiple distances, I can get my random grayscales in a much quicker way. So I don't actually have to use multiple nodes. You can just use the flood filter random color and rely on the fact that each color channel, your red, green, and blue channel, has a unique random grayscale value in it already. Back to the Scully boys. It's often the case where you'll be putting details onto your height maps that are very, very hard for you to see because they're really, really tiny details. So in this case, this sand I'm putting on tops of the boulders and on the skulls. It's very hard to even to see in the final result because it's such a subtle detail. But when you're tuning this, that can be very hard because as I'm laying the sand onto this, it's hard for me to even see that it's there. Something that's really helpful here is to use a normal to visualize this. So with a lot of really fine details, I'm doing this all the time. I'll plug this blend mode into a normal, and this, when it's cranked up, allows me to see that detail being added on much clearer. So as I'm tuning the value of that sand, I can see the result of it very, very easily in here and look at the frequencies of the detail and the scale of it and get a much better idea just by visualizing the normal map. So a lot of the times if you have really fine details, this is a lot simpler, a much simpler way to actually just see them as you're working, right? Instead of directly viewing it in the 3D view. Another example could be the cracks on this tile. There's some really, really fine ones. These sort of hairline cracks. These can be really tough to blend into the original height map because they're so hard to see, right? They do very little. And again, it's much, you want these things. You want a lot of these little subtle details. It makes a big difference in your materials. But again, having that normal map to visualize where those are being added on and then be able to control the opacity of it here and really get a good idea of how much it's actually contributing is really, really helpful. This will happen a lot in your graphs. So I have here this little section of nodes that creates this little pebble shape, and I'm using that to spread it around and load all these kind of broken shards of tile into these damaged pieces we built. So this is okay. It's very repetitive because I can see the exact same pebble just rotated and scaled and stuff like that. So what you could do is duplicate this chain of nodes. So you have a second version, and you can go in this version and change anything you're seeding. So this picks the number of sides the pebble has and makes them all kind of a different shape. I can change the seed of the purlin noise, which will change the way the shape is warped. And I can basically just seed all of these, the random gradient, all of this stuff, and I can get a different pebble out, which is nice because then I can go into the tile sampler here, increase the total number of input images. So it's not just one pebble shape, but I can put in a whole other one. And now I have two shapes to blend between, which helps to break it up. But this is annoying. It fills up a ton of space on the sheet with things that are basically the same. It's very repetitive. So whenever you're doing this, what's usually a better option is I'm just going to select all of the nodes that make this pebble and right click on it and go to create graph from selection. We'll call this YT pebble for YouTube pebble generator, because we already did do it that way. If you go to this new graph that's created, it's just the nodes we had highlight there. Now it's mad at us here. It's giving us a little yellow warning because we don't have an output defined yet. So I'm going to make an output node and click this in. And what's great about this is now I can hop back into our main graph that actually builds the material. And what I can do is I can replace all of these nodes by just dragging that graph we built. I'm hiding it right now in the outliner. So let's move me for a second here. Remove the scenes, all right? Move me. I can take this graph and drag it out into the outliner here. And this is that entire graph we built. And there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to do this. For one thing, I can go to this pebble generator now and replace all of this junk with this one node that is representative of all of it. And I can duplicate it. And if I change the random seed on the node, anything within that graph that can have its random seed changed gets changed. So this is a really nice, it's just it's a rare triple win. This gets you a better looking texture. It's organizationally nicer from a workflow standpoint, right? And it's just simpler to operate in, right? So it's really good across the board. You should do this. Expanding on this, we can also hop into our pebble generator graph here, and we could expose parameters potentially. So if we don't like, for instance, how strong this slope is, you could expose this parameter. So I could expose this and call it slope intensity, and I'll name the identifier and the label the same thing. There's no reason to name them anything different right now. And now when I go back into that main graph again, and will move me back to my normal place I like to be here in the corner. Now when I click on our pebble generator node, you can see that that slope intensity is now exposed, so we can change it from outside the graph and make adjustments per pebble if we want to. If we only want some of these pebbles to have that slope, we can turn the blend down so that it's not as intense just on that iteration of the pebble. So this is really strong. If you ever find yourself making a lot of repetitive elements, which, spoiler, if you're a designer, you probably are doing, pebbles, leaves, sticks and stones, bolts, whatever it is, you can take those nodes, put them into their own graph, and create a generator that builds random versions of those for you, so you don't have to make them yourself. It's often the case that if you're using one of the procedural noises, or really any texture, often what you'll be doing, I'm just making a quick roughness map here using just a histogram range and making this cloud a bit darker, having plenty of variation still. Oftentimes with your details, you're finding them too small, so you'll go to the cloud and you'll zoom it out so that you get higher frequency detail, more of that cloud. That's well and good. Sometimes though, you actually want to zoom into a noise. So what people will do is get a transform and they'll hit the ×2 button here to just zoom in. And they're like, okay, I like this better where we have these kind of bigger billowy noises. That's fine. The thing is, you've broken the tiling. So if you press space to preview the tiling in the 2D viewport, you'll see because we've zoomed into the image, you can see the original and the kind of walking ants, like the dotted line here. You can see where that's where the original shape is. And the Substance has no way of knowing that this and this should tile because those areas didn't match up with each other when they were zoomed in or zoomed out. This happens not just with noise, it can happen with all sorts of stuff. You can get this back using a make it tile photo grayscale node. There's a color version as well. But this is really handy because it's going to create a mask. It basically works in one click here. It's going to create a horizontal and vertical mask and blend between duplicate versions of the texture sample to blend in and out between them. So you can see it here. If I turn the mask horizontal and vertical precision all the way up, it's very easy to see where that mask actually is. And you can change how big the horizontal and vertical masks are independently of each other by putting these up. And you can warp that so it's not a perfectly straight line as well. Usually in practice, I have the precision on fully 0, and I find that that gives you the nicest blend between them. So I don't think I've ever used it on full 1, and I don't like the default 0.5. My version of it is set to 0 as a default because it's what I'm almost always doing. This doesn't work with every texture. Keep in mind, if you're doing something like a grid and you've like rotated this on something other than a 45-degree angle, it can't fix this, right? Even though you've broken the tiling by rotating it, this node can't fix that because you have all those straight lines. It can't blend into them in a way that makes sense. But on anything that's really noisy, this does a really great job of fixing that tiling problem. Subtle one, but a really nice quality of life here. If you're trying to spread something around where you care about the ratio of the sizes, so for instance, if we're putting these footprints all over a texture, we talked about this a little bit in our tile generator node breakdown. The thing that's what we want is there's no real reason for the shoes to get so much wider than they are tall or taller than they are wide. So we can get into this odd situation that if we want more in X than we want Y, we all of a sudden get really impossibly skinny feet here, or the reverse, like really short stubby ones if we want more in Y and more in X. And the tile, and they just get bigger in general or smaller in general as we increase the amount of them we have, which doesn't make a ton of sense. What's cool is you can go down to the size modes on any of the generators, so splatter, generator, sampler, you can do this. Splatter, circular, tile generator, tile sampler. If you switch this to keep ratio, it's cool. Now you can decrease the amount in X and it doesn't change the size of them in X. It just adds more of them. Same thing in Y. So this can be really handy when you have shapes or features of the texture you're spreading around. So the skulls are a good example, where I don't want them to all of a sudden shrink or squash or do all sorts of wacky stuff. I want them to keep the same size ratios, but just have more or less of them. And this does a really good job of that. You can also switch the size to absolute, and that's going to set them to a specific size. And no matter if you have more or less of them, they're still always going to be the exact same size in X and Y. There will just be more or less of them. So those modes are really, really, really important to understand if you're trying to get these kind of specific things done in the tile generators. Here's another full material we built on the Patreon. I've turned the albedo texture off just so we can be uninterrupted by it and just look at the height. This is about flood fills. So this graph will use flood fills. Basically every graph I do uses them at some point. They're all over the place. And what you'll notice is, so here I needed to make a flood fill for all of our different little cracks. And what you'll see is when you plug in your black and white mask into the flood fill, you're gonna have that black crack in between all of the cells still, which comes from the flood fill mask. And if you were to blend this over without closing that distance, you're gonna get this black seam down all of the areas where you have those cracks, which doesn't look very good. So what you need to do is anytime you have a flood fill node used afterwards, so flood filled random grayscale in this case, you'll see I've closed it up. And the way you close this up is using a distance node. And really you just have to remember this simple thing. If I'll just use a flood fill to random color, let's say I wanted all of our little shards of tiles to be random colors. If I bring this over and blend it into our base color periodically, this doesn't work great because, as I mentioned, we get a gap where that black line is, and that doesn't make a ton of sense. None of this makes a ton of sense having like the clown tiles, but you can see how we avoid having color in the cracks, which is probably not what we want. So to close up this gap, it's actually really simple. We just make a distance node. You can see I've done this everywhere. You make a distance node like this, plug it into the source of the distance, and then whatever went into the flood fill goes into the mask input of that distance, right? So as a quick to make this really obvious, we'll put it over here. Flood fill to color. Flood fill to random color. And we'll run that into a distance. And again, whatever went into the mask of the flood fill should go into the mask input of that distance. You can see it closes up. Now, this were really small cracks, so a distance of 10 was able to close it up. You'd almost always just set this to full and set it to only source, and that will ensure you never have that black gap. And now you can see when we use this as our flood fill to random color texture, we do close that gap in. We don't have that annoying gapping between all of our different elements of the flood fill. So you will see me use this on every single flood fill node, and it makes a really massive difference. All right, this one's kind of cool. And it's a bit of a contrived example because you could set this up in other ways, but it's often the case that you'll have like two things in the graph that you want to always mirror each other and have the same settings. So for example, if I change the amount of tiles I have for my normal map bricks, the amount of tiles I have in my color sampler here do not line up. And like I said, you would use a flood fill here and you would make this work properly, but there's scenarios where this happens and you can't use something like a flood fill, and you want the number of tiles here to always change with this. So I'm sure you've been in a place before where you're like, okay, now that I've changed the original, I need to go back here and change the number of these, and that always sucks. If you ever feel yourself sort of like chasing your tail around like that, you always want to fix that if you can. It's really annoying to work with. What's cool is you can expose these parameters and link them together. So if I go to my main tile generator and expose this, and I can just leave, there'll be another, you can do a whole other video on this, but we can just leave this exposed with the defaults and we hit OK. So this is no longer accessible. It goes blue and it's locked out of this node. Where this setting exists now is if I click out on the parent graph and zoom down to the input parameters, that's where this slider lives now. So as I move this, I move the amount of bricks I have in that first tile generator. I'm going to expose the Y one as well. So we'll go to here and hit expose as new graph input. I'm okay with all the defaults. That's fine. And now again, it's locked out of here. It's now promoted to the graph. I can only control it in the input parameters. Sounds annoying, but what's cool is this is now accessible by any other graph in the substance graph. So I can go to the tile generator that's doing the colors here and go to the little hamburger menu here, but instead of going to expose a new graph input, I can use an existing one, which will link them together so that the same number drives both nodes, which is really, really cool. So I can set this one to the X amount and this one to the Y amount. And now when I click on the graph and move these sliders, both tile generators update. So again, this is like a really simple example, but there'll be lots of times where you have two different values or to anything somewhere in the graph that you need to follow each other so that you don't have to do all that manual work, making sure it catches up. And it's really a good idea to start exposing parameters and tying them together to get that work to happen a lot faster. A hotkey I don't think enough people know about is you can scan through the different channels of your texture. So the red, green, blue, and alpha channels and all of them by just hitting these hotkeys here. So if I press the R key, I'll get just my red channel, G, I'll get my green channel, B, I'll get my blue channel, A, I'll get my alpha, and C, I return to the full color mode. This is really useful if you have a bunch of packed information. It used to be the case that to preview them, you would need an RGBA split, plug it in, and then click on the individual node outputs to see them. But now you can do it with this hotkey and it feels much, much better. You can do the same thing later on. We're going to do a trick with normal maps where it's really helpful, for instance, to see just the green channel of the normal map because that's up and down light, or the red channel of the normal map, that's side to side light, which we'll do in a later tip. But this is really helpful for just looking through the different texture channels of your image without having to actually use an RGBA split to preview them. Staying in this graph here for a second, and I'm sure we'll find it because I do it in most graphs that have rock like this. Okay, yeah, here you go. So a cool trick you can do is slope blur, and we have a whole video on slope blur you can look if you want to understand how that one works. It's a very powerful node. One thing you can use it for is to inflate shapes. So if you do a lot of sculpting or sometimes you just want everything to get a little bit bigger, to just like puff up. And what you can do is use a slope blur grayscale, plug in your pebble shape or whatever shape you're making, doesn't have to be pebbles, and you blur that same shape and you can change it. It doesn't have to be super hard, but you can play with this later too. You plug that into the slope of the slope blur, put the samples up, and what you'll see is this actually just like inflates the shape outward. So this can help you close gaps, make shapes look more pillowy. There's a lot of fun stuff you can do with this. but it's a really, really nice trick. So you can blow all the shapes of these stones up a little bit, and changing that blur strength will also affect the result, how soft it is. But you'll need a really low intensity generally, but this does a really good job of just kind of taking that shape and giving it that little inflation. So you'll do stuff like this all the time. So we're back on our grass bullshit here. This is part of a graph we worked with a patron on to remake their material and try to find some areas to improve it on. It's really cool in the Discord watching people work on this stuff. What we did here is you have to be careful about rotations in Substance Designer. So if I'm making these grass blades, for example, and I'm going to spread them around, and we're going to have a ton of them, which is exactly what we did here. Part of the issue with any of the rotations, especially if I want to do what I did, which is use a rotation map. So we'll plug this into rotation map. And we have a whole video on tile samplers if you want to go through them, like you learn what all these settings really do. But we'll use the rotation map multiplier here. The problem is the grass blades pivot from their center, which feels really bad because we would rather them pivot from their root. So we get this kind of flowy look that we achieved in the final result here. So one thing you can do to fix this is pre-transform your shapes here so that because the center of the canvas is where the image rotates from. So because the grass blade here, the center of the image is right in the middle of the grass blade spins around its middle. Whereas if we pre-transform this so that it's the center of the image is at the base of the grass, it'll pivot from there instead. So like the earlier tip, I like to use tile generators to move stuff, especially in this case, because I can know that if I just go to image input one by one and set it to 0.5 and just move it up, I can make sure to get it relatively close to the middle. A way you can visualize this is by using another transform here and seeing where the center is. So I know I need to move it up a little bit. You can also build a fancy node that automatically does this for you. And maybe we'll do that in a video later. But this is pretty close. So now the grass blade will rotate from its center as well as it'll scale from its center, which is really helpful. So if we use this instead, this makes a really big difference because we can scale these up now and you'll see that they have this really nice natural overlap to them. And as we increase the strength of the rotation, you can see them all rotating from their base as opposed to just awkwardly rotating in their middle, which is just not going to work correctly. We're going to get all these weird intersections and they don't blend nearly as well. And any of the rotation randoms, for example, too, they're all spinning around their center. Whereas again, using this one instead has much more reliable rotations coming from the base. The more flood fill tricks here, and something to keep in mind, this is a very common one as well. If I have these simple cells here to make these kind of, simple cobblestones, it's hard for me to get a mask that's the exact middle of these. So what I'll see a lot of people doing and getting kind of frustrated with here is they'll take their edge detect that they use to generate this whole texture from, and they'll just make a thinner version of it and use this to generate their flood fill masks to get an island for each cell. The problem for this is that if we get, say, a flood fill to random grayscale, which would be a common thing to do, and like we did in our earlier tip, we want to close that. So we plug it into the source and whatever went into the flood fill into the mask. Just another reminder about that trick. This doesn't actually line up with the texture because of everything we've done to it. So if we multiply this over, you can see that we cut into this at a really awkward spot. It doesn't actually follow the cells. So you can see where the flood filter random grayscale is being multiplied on. It's not following the curvature of where the cells are. And that's because we've used a bevel, we've had an auto level here. The original edge detect had some roundness to it. And it's totally missing where the cells are now. This happens all the time. So a way to fix this is you just need to make a better mask for your flood fill. And a cool trick you can do here is use normals and curvature to get that mask. In a lot of the Patreon videos and walkthroughs, you've seen me do this a bunch. So what I'll do is just make a normal map first of this texture, because really we just want the crack in between the cells. So if we just make a normal map of our texture first, and then use a curvature, This black line is the concave areas of our texture, the areas where the angles change really rapidly in a concave way versus a convex way, which would give you the curvature, the white lines. In this line, once we isolate it, will really hug the details of our cobblestones in a way that's much more reliable. Right, so even this will work a lot. It's possible we have to blur it in certain areas, but this is a much better mask to use for our flood fills here. So I'll just swap these out and also swap out the mask for our flood fill. Go right here. And this follows it perfectly. We still have this artifact. We can get rid of that with a non-uniform blur somewhere. But now at least our flood fills perfectly follow it, as opposed to before, where we were having it really kind of miss the shape and is really not worth it. So if we compare the difference between our original one, where it completely misses the shape, versus our new curvature where it really tightly hugs them. This graph we built with a patron for this sort of grass here. I built this really quickly. It was probably in like an hour and a half or something like that. So it's a little messy, and something you can do to tidy these graphs up and make them a bit more legible for yourself and others is to use portal nodes. So these are, you might know these as like a named reroute. These can be called different things in different software packages, but they're really, really helpful. So in this case, we have this node, this rock texture. It's spread out throughout the graph. It's being used in multiple different places, and this just gets really annoying to look at. It can be really confusing too when you have just stuff stretching all over the place depending on how you work. What you can do is make a dot node. Now there's 3 ways to do that. You can actually just search for a dot node and build it. So I actually had it in line there, but you can build one like normal. You can, if you already have a noodle out here, you can press Alt and click to get one along the line. Alt and left click. Alternatively, you can also drag off the node and then click Alt. As you're holding the left click down, it will create a dot node. They all make the exact same node, this dot here. And really in the past, people would just use these to hold on to stuff. So you would create a holder somewhere to move these out of the way. Right, so that they're not so obstreperous, I guess, or obstructive. But what you can do instead now is you can plug this in, and on the dot node itself, you can rename it. So you can call this rock portal node, whatever you want. The name doesn't really matter as long as it's something that makes sense to you and for people who are going to open the graph. And then anywhere I need that node, I can make another dot node. Now we're not jumping too far here, but I can go to here, and now in the input portal dropdown, I can pick that node that we used. And now I can reroute all of these. And we can make another one over here to drop into the level we're using. And what's really great is it cuts down on all of this intergraph wiring. Right, so I can name this one as well, the rock portal node, plug this in, and everything still works the same. And if you ever want to see where all this is headed, you can just click on any of the portal nodes. So you can click on this one, you can click over on any of the receiving little radio symbols here, and you'll be able to see where stuff went. So you're not going to lose track. I think people are worried sometimes that they're going to lose track of where stuff went. That's not going to happen. You can always click to view these if you want to. This makes a really big difference in just organizing the graph. This is another graph we looked at recently. On the Patreon, we were building this big catacomb wall, and you can see how often I use these. Right at the end of every section, as I'm working on the height map, if I'm sending stuff off to other places in the graph, I'm making extensive use of these portal nodes so that I don't have to have a bunch of cross node wires throwing it all over the place. I can have this all work through the graph in like a really organized way. This is probably the most advanced tip on the list, but I do think it's really worth doing. So don't be afraid of this. It's very fun. So over here, and super useful. Over here, I've applied our 6 pebbles from our pebble generator tip, and I've spread them all around. Now, there will be cases where you just come up against the limitations of certain nodes. So it might be the case that I actually want more than 6 possible pebbles. Maybe that's fine, maybe it's not, but it's just an example of a thing where I'm limited by the stock node here. I can only have 6 input numbers, 6 input patterns. It's just a limitation of the node. It's where it is. You can modify all of this stuff, right? So you can crack open any node in Designer. You just right click and go to open reference, and you can load how the actual tile generator works, which is really cool. You can actually look through this all and see how it's actually working, which is really, really great. You can go and actually like look at the effects map and see what's actually happening here. which is great. Be in the iterate node, you can see all the parts of the tile generator. Now, obviously you need to kind of understand how some of this is working to really kind of make sense of it. But a lot of time you'd be surprised at how easy this is to adjust. So for one thing, I can't make any changes to this because the package is read only, which is good. You wouldn't want to come in here and screw up with this. Change something and then all your tile generators are broken. So you should always make a version of this that's custom, that's just for you. So if you screw it up, it's not the end of the world. So I can just copy this graph, make a new package and paste it into it. And then this one will be unlocked because it's not the same package as the system one. So you can call this whatever you want. You can call it like your custom tile generator. Right, so you would change the name of the graph there. You would also in the graph here want to change not just the identifier, but the label of this. So that when we use this later, it has the right label. But you can see in this FX map, it takes all of the image inputs. You can see them here. So it just requires a little reading around. And, you know, some like people in the Discord can help you out. There's a lot of really good resources online. The algorithmic community is really good at the Adobe community is really good at helping people with this kind of thing. And I'll do lots of videos on this stuff. In fact, we just did one about one that was very heavy on pixel processors and parameters, exposing input parameters. So you can see the pattern inputs here, and there's 6 of them for no real reason. That's just the amount that there are. But we could duplicate this chain here, and I'm going to go to the pattern input, and it already identifies it as 7 because we duplicated this one, which was called 6. So because there can't be 2 nodes with the same identifier, it automatically renamed it 7. But the label is not renamed properly. So we want to make sure that the label for this one is input 7. And we'll just plug it in to the 6th input on the effects map. Then all we have to do is double click on the graph and go down to the input parameters here. And we can find the pattern input number. And instead of maxing it out at 6, let's just max it out at 7. And then the last thing you would probably want to do is, because we've created a new image input here, it's showing up below the background, which just visually doesn't look great. So we'll just bump it up a second. What's cool now is you can save that graph, put it somewhere in a folder of yours, and you can link to that path, or you just open it and drag that node in. And now you have your custom tile generator. And on this one, we have that additional functionality of being able to select more than 6 patterns. So we can go to image input, turn the pattern number up to 7 on this one, and we can do all the same stuff, but now we have that additional pattern, right? And this is just an example of how you can expand on this. There will be lots of times where you open up different noises or different function graphs, all sorts of different stuff, and you'll wish it could do something that it can't do. I want people to be like confident you can go in and change these things, right? It's a little bit of learning, but don't be afraid of it. Taking that kind of step and digging in and making adjustments to those kind of core noises and nodes really will make you much better at Substance Designer really quick and help you understand what's going on under the hood in a much clearer way. This is a good one to practice on, but I would get used to practicing with this as just a general good idea. So I thought a really good name for this video was going to be 20 tips in 20 minutes, and there was just no way that was ever going to happen. I can't keep videos under 40 minutes, let alone 20. But I hope you found at least some of those helpful. I have a huge laundry list of these that I'd like to get to. It's like 80 or 90 items at this point. We'll do those in multiple videos. It's probably going to be a thing that I revisit every once in a while to try to get these kind of bite-sized pieces of info out. And a lot of them are smaller parts from various videos we've done both on and off the Patreon. But it's nice to have them in these kind of little areas where we can collect them all into one kind of easy to access place and just have that list available. If you liked everything you saw today, or some of what you saw today at least, I'd appreciate liking the video or subscribing. That's really helpful. As well, if you'd like to access, today we looked through a lot of stuff that we built on the Patreon. So if you'd like super long tutorials, they're, big multi-hour long guided tutorials for making different materials and fun kind of extras that we do outside the channel, you can support me over there if you'd like access to that stuff. Discord community talking about how to make their materials better. Like I said, there's some materials in this video as well that were us working on someone's material from the Patreon. So if you'd like to go over there and get access to that stuff, that'd be much appreciated. But other than that, I appreciate you guys just sticking through and hopefully picking something up, and we'll see you in the next video.